Hello, fellow classmates. My name is Tracy Weathers, and I bring you greetings from Carson, California. I am here to share with you my project on interpersonal communication from the Liberty University Counseling 508 class. Next slide. What is communication? According to John Stewart, communication is the continuous, complex, collaborative process of verbal and nonverbal meaning making. It works by having the sender translate ideas into words or other kinds of messages, and the receiver to perceive the message and translate it into ideas. It consists of getting your ideas across, and it can be evaluated in terms of the match, fit, or fidelity between message sent and message received. And finally, communication is co-constructed. We make meaning together through dialogue. Next slide. Dialogue stems from the Greek word dia, meaning through, and logos, meaning understanding. Dialogue is synonymous with interpersonal communication. Dialogue is an equitable transaction. This means that everyone has an opportunity to participate and everyone has a voice. Dialogue happens when the people involved are present to each other as persons. Research into learning organizations define dialogue as a kind of collective mindfulness in which the interactants are more concerned about group effectiveness than about individual ego or position. Next slide. Interpersonal communication. Interpersonal communication is the kind or quality of contact that happens when the people involved talk and listen in ways that maximize the presence of the personal. The main characteristic of interpersonal communication is that the people involved are contacting each other as persons. When communicators give and receive and talk and listen in ways that emphasize their uniqueness, unmeasurability, and responsiveness, their reflectiveness, and their addressability, the communication between them is interpersonal. Interpersonal communication involves verbal and nonverbal behaviors, exchanges, and the use of behaviors that fit into the specific purpose of the communicative interaction. The intended result of interpersonal communication is a change of attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors of the interactions, and perhaps constructive resolutions. Next slide. Enlarging the conversation. Identified needs plus intentional resourcing equal enlarging the conversation. Enlarging the conversation is more than merely increasing the length or the depth of a conversation, but it involves identifying the communication needs, intentionally looking for ways to meet those needs, and increasing the opportunity for effective communication or dialogue. Burley Allen teaches us to be aware of our listening ability and to pay attention to those who are listening to us. Listening and talking both require work and effort. And according to Sheila Shipley, listening is a deliberate act that requires a conscious commitment from the listener. Next slide. Carbonell's four-temperate model of behavior. Uniquely you assessment. I have been identified as an IDS type. That means that I am inspiring, dynamic, and submissive. My Graph 1 Type 1 result, this is expected of me, says the people expect me to be inspiring, influencing, to shine, and to be a show-off. They see me as animated, energetic, fascinating, and friendly. They see me as determined, loving, and caring. My Graph 2, Type 2, IDS, this is me. I am active and task-oriented. I tend to be inspiring, dominating, and submissive all at the same time. I am not very cautious or calculating. I have very broad vision, and I can focus on several things at once. I do what I have to do to move on to other projects so that I may work alongside others. On the downside, I tend to be pushy and overuse my people skills to convince others to do what they may not want to do. I have a tendency to offend others with my direct, demeaning, and demanding demeanor. I can be overly dramatic and expressive, which can sometimes cause me to say things that hurt or offend others. I sometimes use my words as weapons against those who oppose me. Next slide. Overarching goal. My overarching goal is to improve my interpersonal skills by increasing my level 1 empathetic listening ability and to exhibit the character and integrity of Christ in my communication with all people. Next slide. What are my barriers to effective interpersonal communication? I have a propensity to wait for an opportunity to interject when listening. I tend to constantly interrupt during conversations. I am a biased listener. A biased listener is a person who listens according to their opinion and the value of what will be said. John Stewart describes this as attribution, devising theories or explanations about other people's behaviors. I have been guilty of labeling people as overtalkers, know-it-alls, or even attention seekers. This behavior is also called fundamental attribution error and is the mistaken tendency to attribute people's behavior to internal rather than external causes. Next slide. Meta-messages. A meta-message is the meaning not said, who is saying it, or the fact that it is being said at all. Meta-messages are those hidden messages that we apply to a message being received, and meta-messages are difficult to decipher. These messages are particularly common amongst family communication because they often form out of the history of the relationship and almost always have to do with the ways conversation partners are defining themselves and each other. Next slide. Internal and external noise factors. Internal and external noise pollution factors are factors and barriers that prevent effective listening. My noise factors are externally, I allow myself to be easily distracted by things like the voice of a person, their tone of voice, telephone calls, the person's mannerism and appearance. Internally, self-assessment causes me to constantly check to see if I'm looking and sounding good. And again, I place values and biases on the people I'm listening to and what they're saying. Next slide. Conflict and resistance. Stewart posits that the purpose of a conflict between intimates is not to agree, but to bring you and your partner closer. He further suggests that we prepare ourselves to argue and making sure to avoid the magic rules for ruining discussion by utilizing 5 steps for preparing to argue. Step 1. Make sure that the issue is a current issue and not something rehashed from the past. Step 2. Try to let go of it. Step 3. See if now is the time to discuss this issue. Step 4. Be certain that communication is your aim. And step 5. Be clear that the problem is the relationships and not your partners. Next slide. How do I apply all of this information to my overarching goal to become a better listener and communicator? First, I apply the 3 competencies of empathetic listening. Number 1, focusing. Orient my attention to the person I'm listening to by aiming my posture, making natural and appropriate eye contact, moving responsively, and making responsive sounds. 2, encouraging. Pulling more out of the talker with cue words like say more or keep talking please. Mirroring. Repeating a key word or phrase from the other person's statement. Asking the clarifying question. making an effort to understand more clearly what the person is saying. And open questions. Asking open-ended questions, they encourage the talker to speak more and to enlarge the conversation. And finally, using attentive silence, staying focused, and giving the other person a chance to talk, and more importantly, listen. And 3, reflecting skills. Paraphrasing, restating what I believe I've heard the person say, and giving an example from my own experience that I believe explains the other person's point of view. Next slide. Applying this information to my overarching goal continued. Rebecca Shafir suggests mindful listening. Mindful listening is a spectrum of listening that includes accurate receiving, retaining information, and sustaining attention, attending to your own speech, and encouraging the person you are listening to. The last and most important skill to develop is to listen to myself by becoming aware of my own internal thought processes. Developing my capacity to examine myself critically helps me to understand and to be aware of my beliefs and values and attitudes in order to understand and reshape them. By doing this, I can reach a level of self-acceptance that helps me to remain open to my own self-defeating behaviors. Next slide. In conclusion, effective interpersonal interaction and communication is a concept that requires effective, empathetic listening, clear, thorough, thoughtful, and respectful communication, and the mutual goal of maximizing the potential of a relationship. By applying these skills presented in this project, we can develop and enhance our interpersonal skills as well as our communication skills, which will in turn help us to maintain peace and be better representatives of Christ. Romans 12:11 says, if it is possible, as much as lieth in you, live peaceably with all men. Thank you for letting me share my project on interpersonal communication.